In 1899, a young British officer named Robert Mackay Thompson stepped off a troop transport in South Africa, carrying something that would define the next 50 years of armed conflict across 3 continents. A Webley Mark IV revolver holstered at his hip, its blued steel frame catching the harsh African sun. He would fire it exactly twice in anger during the entire Boer War. Both shots counted. When he retired in 1931, he still carried that same revolver, its serial number worn smooth by decades of leather, its action as crisp as the day it left the Birmingham factory. His grandson sold it at auction in 1987 for £42. The buyer was an American who had never heard of Webley and Scott. That story, repeated in 1,000 different forms across the 20th century, is exactly how America lost something it never quite knew it had, a transatlantic military sidearm legacy that shaped every battlefield from the Khyber Pass to the beaches of Normandy, and that died quietly in peacetime bureaucracy rather than in any war. Today, we are going to walk through 20 of the most important, most misunderstood, and most overlooked Webley and Scott revolvers ever made, and you are going to understand exactly why American soldiers, American gunsmiths, and American collectors kept looking across the Atlantic for answers that their own domestic industry refused to give them. If you are new here, subscribe right now, because we cover this kind of lost technical history every single week, and you will not find it anywhere else. Number 20 is going to surprise you. Number 20. The Webley Mark I 1887. Most Americans who know anything about British revolvers think the story starts with the World Wars. They are wrong by about 40 years. The Webley Mark I was adopted as the official British service revolver on November 8, 1887, chambered in .455 Webley, a cartridge so powerful that American ordnance officers who tested it at Springfield Armory in 1889 wrote in their official report that it produced recoil characteristics unsuitable for general service issue, which was the polite Victorian way of saying it, knocked unprepared shooters backward. The Mark I used a top brake action that allowed the entire barrel and cylinder assembly to hinge forward and downward, automatically ejecting all 6 spent cases simultaneously. American revolvers of the era, including the Colt single-action army that had just won the West, required manual extraction of each cartridge individually. The Webley system was, in pure mechanical terms, a generation ahead. American military observers watched, took careful notes, and then went home and did nothing about it for the next 12 years. The Mark I was not perfect. Its cylinder gap was wider than ideal. Its sights were rudimentary even by the standards of the day, and the grip angle suited British shooting techniques that American soldiers found awkward. But it established a standard of reliability under field conditions that the U.S. Army would not match with its own service revolvers until the adoption of the Smith & Wesson Model 10 in 1899, and even then, only partially. Birmingham produced 10 Sidearm Mark I revolvers in the first 2 years. Every single one of them worked. Number 19. The Webley Mark II, 1894. The British Army is famous for many things, and one of them is improving a perfectly functional weapon just enough to make it slightly different without making it meaningfully better. The Mark II addressed 6 specific complaints from field officers, 4 of which were legitimate, and 2 of which were the result of soldiers using their revolvers as hammers, which the Mark II also could not prevent. The most significant change was a strengthened cylinder stop, which reduced the tendency of the Mark I to rotate slightly under recoil in extreme conditions. American arms designers following the development in trade publications noted the improvement. It did not change their procurement decisions. Number 18. The Webley Fosbury Automatic Revolver, 1901. Here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. William Fosbury was a British Army officer and Victoria Cross recipient who decided around 1895 that the revolver was fine in principle but could be improved by making it automatic. The result was a revolver whose cylinder and barrel assembly recoiled backward on each shot, rotating the cylinder and cocking the hammer automatically. It was, by any engineering standard of its era, a work of extraordinary ingenuity. The U.S. Army tested it. Colt engineers examined it carefully. The mechanism worked exactly as advertised. It was also extremely sensitive to dirt, required ammunition loaded to precise specifications, and had a tendency to malfunction if fired from a non-standard grip, which is how soldiers actually fire weapons when they are frightened and exhausted. The American market loved it for exactly 6 years. Then the 1911 pistol arrived, and everyone forgot about automatic revolvers for the next century. Number 17. The Webley Mark III, 1894. Running parallel to the Mark II in production, the Mark III was produced primarily for commercial sale and colonial police forces, rather than British Army mainline service. This distinction matters enormously for understanding the American connection. It was the Mark III, not the military issue variants, that first arrived in significant numbers in the United States. Traveling salesmen from Webley's American agents demonstrated it to police departments in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia between 1895 and 1903. Several departments purchased small quantities for evaluation. None adopted it officially. The reason given in every case was the same. American officers were already trained on American revolvers, and retraining was expensive. The real reason, as internal memos from at least 2 departments later revealed, was that buying British firearms for American law enforcement created political complications that no chief of police wanted to explain to his city council. Number 16. The .455 Webley cartridge. You cannot understand why the American military relationship with Webley and Scott was complicated without understanding the .455 Webley cartridge, and you cannot understand the cartridge without understanding what the British Army was actually fighting in the 1880s and 1890s. The enemies British soldiers faced in colonial warfare were often physically large, frequently motivated by religious conviction that reduced their sensitivity to pain, and sometimes using drugs before battle that made conventional wound ballistics unreliable. The .455 Webley was designed to stop a man reliably with a single hit, regardless of his mental state, and it did this through a large, heavy, relatively slow bullet that transferred its energy efficiently into tissue. American ordnance philosophy of the same era favored higher velocity and smaller caliber. When U.S. forces encountered similar stopping power problems in the Philippines in 1899, they briefly returned to the Pomeroy .45 Colt for frontline use, an implicit acknowledgement that the British had been right all along, expressed through a procurement decision rather than any official statement. If you have made it this far, drop a comment telling me which of these you had never heard of before. I read every single one. Number 15. The Webley Mark IV, 1899. This is the revolver that Robert Mackay Thompson carried into South Africa, and it is, by consensus of historians and collectors who have handled all 6 military marks, the finest revolver the Birmingham factory ever produced. The Boer War was the first modern conflict in which rifle accuracy at long range made conventional cavalry charges suicidal, which meant that officers found themselves in precisely the kind of close quarters fighting for which the Webley Mark IV had been designed. After-action reports collected by the British War Office between 1899 and 1902 showed that officer casualties who were armed with revolvers suffered significantly lower rates of fatal wounding in close combat than those relying on swords. American military observers attached to British units sent detailed reports back to Washington. The reports were filed. The Mark IV was not evaluated. Number 14. The Webley Mark V, 1913. Between 1902 and 1913, Webley and Scott made incremental improvements that resulted in the Mark V, a revolver so similar to the Mark IV that many collectors can only distinguish them by their serial number ranges and minor proof mark differences. The significance of the Mark V is not mechanical. It is political. By 1913, the British Army was quietly aware that a European war was coming, and began placing orders for Webley revolvers at a rate that the Birmingham factory could only barely sustain. American manufacturers were not involved in these discussions. American observers were not invited to the planning meetings. The transatlantic military relationship that would define the First World War was not yet built, and the weapon that British officers would carry into the trenches was entirely a product of British industry, British design philosophy, and British manufacturing. That would begin to change, slowly and somewhat accidentally, in August 1914. Number 13. The Webley Mark VI, 1915. The Mark VI is the most produced British military revolver in history, with approximately 300,000 manufactured between 1915 and 1923. It was also the revolver that American soldiers first encountered in large numbers when the United States entered the First World War in 1917. American officers arriving in France were frequently given Mark VI revolvers from British stocks when their own 45 ACP pistols were unavailable, a situation that was more common than official histories acknowledge. The Mark VI chambered in .455 Webley was a substantially more powerful weapon than the Hauser 45 ACP 1911 pistol in terms of bullet weight and sectional density, though the 1911 had advantages in magazine capacity and rate of fire. American soldiers who used both weapons in the field generally preferred the 1911 for its capacity and preferred the Webley for its perceived stopping power. This is the kind of nuanced comparative assessment that gets lost when historians focus only on official procurement records rather than personal accounts. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of detail, because we go deep every week. Number 12. The Webley and Scott .38 Service Revolver, 1923. After the First World War, a committee of British Army officers spent 3 years studying casualties and wound ballistics before recommending, in 1922, that the British service revolver be reduced from .455 to .38 caliber. The reasoning was that a smaller cartridge meant less recoil, which meant better accuracy under stress, which produced more effective hits than the large caliber misses that characterized actual combat shooting. The American military had reached the opposite conclusion after the Philippines campaign, and stuck with large caliber. The British Army adopted the .38 S&W cartridge, not the American .38 Special, but a different round with the same bullet diameter, and Webley and Scott began producing the Mark IV .38, which was subsequently rejected by the British Army in favor of the Enfield No. 2 in a procurement decision so controversial it is still debated by British firearms historians today. Number 11. The Webley and Scott Mark IV .38, 1929. The British Army's decision to adopt the Enfield No. 2 instead of the Webley Mark IV .38 was not based on the merits of the weapons. The Webley design was independently assessed as superior in durability, reliability, and ease of maintenance. The decision was based on the fact that the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield could manufacture the Enfield design using government facilities, reducing dependence on private contractors. Webley and Scott sued the British government for patent infringement, arguing that the Enfield design incorporated their patented improvements without compensation. They won the lawsuit. They were awarded £250. The British Army continued to use the Enfield No. 2. The Webley Mark IV .38 was sold commercially and to Commonwealth police forces, where it served with distinction for decades. American police departments that had passed on the .455 variants looked at the .38 Mark IV with somewhat more interest, but the Smith & Wesson military and police revolver already owned the American service revolver market, and Webley had no realistic path to competing with a domestically produced weapon backed by a century of American distribution networks. Number 10. The Webley Metropolitan Police Model, 1883. Going back further in the timeline, the Metropolitan Police Model deserves its own entry because it represents the road not taken for American law enforcement. Produced initially for London's Metropolitan Police in the early 1880s, this was a smaller, lighter version of the military Webley designed specifically for police carry rather than battlefield use. Its top break action allowed officers to reload quickly. Its smaller caliber, typically .320 or .380, reduced the risk of over-penetration in urban environments, and its compact dimensions allowed concealed carry and plainclothes work. It was, in essence, the police service revolver that American law enforcement would not develop for itself until the Smith & Wesson Model 10 in the late 1890s and the subsequent proliferation of the Mark 38 special cartridge. New York City police officers who traveled to London for professional exchanges in the 1890s returned with detailed descriptions of the Metropolitan Police model. Their recommendations for similar American adoption were not acted upon. Number 9. The Webley and Scott Semi-Automatic Pistol, 1906. People who think of Webley and Scott as a revolver company sometimes forget that the firm produced one of the most successful early semi-automatic pistols in British history. The 1906 semi-automatic, chambered in .455 Webley self-loading, a unique cartridge specifically designed for this pistol, was adopted by the Royal Navy and Royal Flying Corps as a standard sidearm. Its unusual delayed blowback action, which used a rotating barrel to reduce rearward force on the slide, was examined by American pistol designers during the period of intense semi-automatic development that preceded the adoption of the 1911. John Browning's locked breech design, which Colt manufactured, used a fundamentally different operating principle, but the Webley semi-automatic's reliability record influenced the specification requirements that American military testers wrote for the pistol trials. The 1911 won, deservedly, on its merits. But the Webley semi-automatic's shadow was on the wall of the testing room. Number 8. The Webley Wilkinson, 1884. This is the one that most American collectors have never seen in person. Henry Wilkinson was a London sword maker. The firm made presentation swords for the British military, who partnered with Webley to produce a premium version of the service revolver for officers who wanted something better finished than the standard military issue. The Webley Wilkinson revolvers were manufactured to tighter tolerances, fitted with better sights, and finished to a higher standard than anything coming off the standard production line. American officers who served in joint operations with the British, particularly during the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900, where American and British forces fought side by side, encountered Webley Wilkinson revolvers carried by British officers of means, and several wrote home about them with obvious admiration. At least 4 Webley Wilkinson revolvers are known to have been shipped to the United States as personal gifts between 1898 and 1910. Their whereabouts are unknown. Number 7. The Webley and Scott No. 1 Mark I flare pistol. Yes, Webley and Scott made flare pistols, and the British military's adoption of their signal pistol in 1915 created an unexpected American connection. When American forces entered the war in 1917, interoperability with British units required that American officers be able to use British signal equipment, which meant training on Webley flare pistols. Thousands of American officers handled Webley and Scott hardware for the first time, not as weapons, but as signal equipment. Several wrote home that the mechanical quality was unlike anything they had encountered in American-made military equipment. This is not a small thing. The impressions formed by officers in the field in 1917 and 1918 shaped American interest in British firearms for the following 2 decades, and the Webley flare pistol was part of that formation. Here is something almost nobody talks about. The American government purchased Webley and Scott revolvers directly for issue during both World Wars, and these purchases are documented in procurement records that are freely available in the National Archives, but almost never cited in popular firearms histories. We will come back to this in a moment. Number 6. The Webley Mark VI, .45 ACP conversion. After the First World War, large quantities of .455 Webley ammunition became unavailable in the United States, making the substantial number of Mark VI revolvers that had arrived during the war essentially unusable for American owners. A cottage industry developed among American gunsmiths to convert Mark VI cylinders to fire. .45 ACP cartridges using half-moon clips, the same clips developed for the Smith & Wesson Model 1917, which had faced the identical problem of chambering a semi-automatic cartridge in a revolver. The Webley Mark VI, converted to .45 ACP, became a moderately popular revolver among American sportsmen in the 1920s, praised for its reliability and damned for the minor instability introduced by the conversion. Original unconverted Mark VI revolvers in .455 are now significantly more valuable to collectors than converted examples, which is a precise inversion of their respective utility in 1920. Number 5. The Webley and Scott .32 semi-automatic, 1906. The smaller sibling of the .455 semi-automatic, the .32 ACP version of the Webley self-loading pistol was produced in large numbers for commercial sale and police use. It arrived in the United States through commercial channels in the years before the First World War, and found a small but enthusiastic market among American shooters who appreciated its flat profile for concealed carry, a need that American pistol manufacturers of the era were only beginning to address seriously. The .32 ACP cartridge was the same round used in many European pistols, giving the Webley a degree of ammunition commonality that its .455 military siblings lacked. American gun dealers who stocked it in the 1910s and 1920s found that it sold consistently, if slowly, to a clientele of businessmen and professionals who wanted something more modern than a revolver without committing to the larger and more conspicuous 1911. Number 4. The Webley & Scott. .38 Semi-Automatic, 1910. The .38 version of the Webley semi-automatic was developed for police use and found its most significant adoption with the South African police, a reminder that the British Empire's firearms ecosystem extended across territories larger than the continental United States. American police administrators who studied South African police methods in the 1920s and 1930s, and there was a small but real tradition of such exchanges, encountered the Webley .38 semi-automatic in operational use and brought back detailed assessments. None of these assessments resulted in American procurement, but they contributed to the body of knowledge about semi-automatic pistol design that informed the American transition from revolvers to semi-automatics, a transition that would not be complete until the 1980s. The Webley, in other words, was part of the conversation that eventually produced the Beretta M9, even if it was never in any procurement competition. Number 3. The Webley Mark VI in Second World War service. When Britain entered the Second World War in September 1939, the British military found itself simultaneously equipping a rapidly expanding force and dealing with the limitations of its 1938 decision to standardize on the Enfield No. 2. Webley Mark VI revolvers from First World War stocks were recalled from storage, refurbished, and reissued. American Lend-Lease discussions in 1940 and 1941 briefly included the possibility of supplying American revolvers to British forces, which would have created a direct and documented transatlantic military sidearm exchange. Instead, the British received Smith & Wesson and Colt revolvers under Lend-Lease, which meant that British officers in the Second World War sometimes carried American revolvers, while American officers, still equipped with the 1911, were indirectly familiar with British revolver design through the Lend-Lease supply chain running in the other direction. The relationship was real. The documentation is in the archives. Almost nobody has read it. Number 2. The Webley & Scott Green Line Commercial Revolvers, 1920-1939. The interwar period was both the commercial peak and the beginning of the terminal decline of Webley & Scott's American market presence. The firm produced a range of commercial revolvers for the American market during the 1920s and 1930s, distinguished by green felt lining in their presentation cases, a detail that collectors now use to identify authentic period commercial pieces. These revolvers were sold through American dealers at prices competitive with comparable Smith & Wesson and Colt products, and in purely mechanical terms they were superior to many American competitors in durability and action quality. They did not sell well. American buyers, given a choice between a British and an American firearm at similar prices, chose American with a consistency that no amount of mechanical superiority could overcome. Webley & Scott withdrew from active American marketing by 1939. The green-lined cases now appear at auction, at prices that would have seemed impossible to the buyers who originally passed them over. Number 1. The Webley Mark VI and the Springfield Armory connection. This is the entry that required the most research and that American firearms historians have most thoroughly buried in technical footnotes and procurement archives. In 1917 and again in 1942, Springfield Armory, the United States government's own weapons manufacturing facility, conducted detailed technical analyses of the Webley Mark VI revolver. The 1917 analysis was part of the emergency procurement assessment triggered by American entry into the First World War, when domestic pistol production was insufficient to equip an army expanding from 100 Zirazullners to 4 Zirazullners men in under 2 years. The engineers at Springfield Armory examined the Webley Mark VI top brake ejection system and concluded, in a classified report that was declassified in 1976, that it was mechanically superior to any American military revolver then in production for speed of reloading under combat conditions. They recommended against adoption on grounds of cartridge incompatibility and manufacturing retooling costs. This is the sentence that determined the course of American military sidearm history. Not, "This weapon is inferior," but, "We cannot afford to change now." The 1942 analysis reached substantially similar conclusions. The 1911 pistol was already the American standard. The Webley's mechanical contributions to American firearms development were real, documented, and never acknowledged publicly. Robert McKay Thompson's grandson sold his grandfather's Mark IV in 1987 for £42, which was roughly $65 American at the exchange rate of the time, because the buyer did not know what he was holding and the seller no longer remembered why it mattered. That is the complete story of how America lost its transatlantic military sidearm legacy. Not in any battle, not in any policy decision, not in any deliberate choice, but in the accumulated weight of small decisions made by people who were too busy winning wars and managing empires to notice that the thing they were walking away from was worth keeping. The knowledge existed. The documentation exists. The revolvers are still in collections on both sides of the Atlantic, their cylinders turning as smoothly today as they did in 1915. What was lost was not the weapons, but the understanding of what they represented. A moment when British and American military traditions were close enough to share a sidearm, and a series of moments when both sides chose not to. If you made it to the end of this video, I want you to do one thing. Go find a Webley revolver at a gun show, pick it up, operate the top break action, and feel the cylinder drop into your palm with all 6 cases ejected at once. Then ask yourself why American revolvers never worked this way. Leave your answer in the comments. I will be reading everyone. And if this kind of deep history is what you come here for, subscribe, because we do this every week. And next week's video covers something that happened in a Birmingham factory in 1902 that changed military firearms design on 3 continents, and that exactly nobody has ever made a video about. See you then.